From Sudan to Egypt to Libya, popular uprisings, call them revolutions if you will, across the Arab world have been turned on their head. Why has change been so hard to come by? Revolutions in reverse on Roundtable. Hello and a very warm welcome to the programme from me, David Foster. Protests on the streets, authoritarian rulers ousted from power, hope in the air, and then frustration. Popular movements calling for change have, to a large extent, failed to live up to expectations. So, what makes a revolution successful?
The Arab Spring of 2011 brought hopes of lasting change, but to many, counter-revolution is now the dominant political trend in the Middle East. In Sudan, on June the 3rd, paramilitary forces killed over 100 protesters. They'd been calling for a transition to civilian government after the overthrow of President Omar al-Bashir. Powerful Gulf Arab states such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE have pledged $3 billion to keep Sudan's de facto military rulers in power. Gulf monarchies have also supported Khalifa Haftar's military government in eastern Libya over the UN-backed one in Tripoli, and supported General Sisi in Egypt after the 2013 coup. The recent death in custody of Egypt's first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi, served as a reminder of how short-lived that country's revolution was. In Algeria, protests led to the resignation in April of longtime President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, but 3 months on there is no date set to elect his successor. This year's events have provided more proof that revolutions are hard-won and even harder to sustain.
Let's get the conversation going. With me at the round table, we have Dr. Ian Black, visiting fellow at the London School of Economics, who for many years was The Guardian's Middle East editor. Neglaa Fathi Abdalla is here, freelance journalist and Sudan protest organiser. Nasim Ahmed, too, political analyst at Middle East Monitor, and Seifeddine Ferjani, Middle East analyst as well, whose father was part of the Tunisian uprising. We're going to talk about revolutions in general, more probably towards the end of the programme. But let's talk about Sudan. First, you, Ian. Why is it that what is happening in Sudan, almost everybody seems to say, will impact right across the region?
I think the answer is that whatever happens in a country internally, there are regional power players who have an interest in the outcome of what is happening in that particular country. That's obviously a big picture response, but we see a Middle East, particularly since the beginning of the Arab Spring in 2011, where the regional powers that aspire to their own influence support one side or another in the internal struggles that we're seeing now revived, if you like, whether it's in Sudan or Libya, Algeria to some extent too, often described by people as, the second stage of the Arab Spring. And as with the first stage, those countries, whether it's the Saudis, the Emiratis, Egypt, or Turkey, Iran, on the other side, they see that the stakes are of importance to them too.
Nasim, if we have the United Arab Emirates, if you have Saudi Arabia, if you have Egypt, as Ian says, on one side, and they want to see these uprisings fail, explain to people why they would want that.
Well, I think first thing to say is that I think from 2011, from the Arab uprising, the Gulf countries have been on desperation mode. They've been fighting existential battle for their own survival. That's how they see it. And that was reinforced with the 2014 oil price drop from, I think, $140 to something like $40. So I think since then, they've been hypersensitive. And you can see that from the murder of Jamal Khashoggi to intervening in every social uprising within the Middle East.
But just help us here. Why would an uprising in Sudan, replacing an authoritarian ruler, perhaps that's part of the answer, why would replacing Bashir with a more moderate, if you like, international regime. Why would that affect Saudi Arabia? Why would that affect the UAE when oil prices are part of this?
Yeah,
Why,
I think
why that
it goes to what Ian said, that there's a Cold War, if you like, within the whole Middle East. And you have Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the UAE on one side, you have Turkey and Qatar on the other side, and you can even add the Muslim Brotherhood to that list as well. So there's a power play taking place to dominate and control and influence the politics of the Middle East. And Sudan is a major piece within that. And if Sudan falls, there's tensions in the Horn of Africa as well, which all these different countries are vying for influence in the Horn of Africa. So if Sudan falls, which way is it going to fall? Is it going to fall on the side of the Qataris and the Turks, or is it going to fall on the side of the UAE and the Saudi Arabia, and to a lesser extent, Egypt?
Neglaa, I'm going to bring you in here because you've got a lot of family out in Khartoum. Massacre there on June the 3rd, after the ousting of Omar al-Bashir with the military in control. What are they telling you about the military's promises, if you like, of ceding power to a civilian government and what form that might take? Because the suggestions now going around is that they have no intention of doing so. And that would suit Egypt, that would suit Saudi, that would suit the UAE if the military stayed in power.
Of course. So the military council, as you've just said, they have been saying from the beginning that they are all for handing power over to a civilian government in due course, in due time. And we had the intervention from the Ethiopian PM, who has come to help the negotiations between the TMC and between the SBA, the
Transitional Military Council.
Yeah, Transitional Military Council and the Sudanese Professionals Association. He put forward the proposal, which the SPA conditionally agreed to, and the TMC said, no, we reject. And now, post the Millions Man's March, the TMC has clearly stated that they have no intention, their words, no intention of handing power over to civilian government, and they intend to rule.
So what's that going to mean?
Well, I think from people on the ground, they're not accepting it. The Sudanese Professionals Association has put forward their program for the week, many more protests regionally across the country, and around to a civil disobedience.
Okay, civil disobedience, as we saw June the 3rd, it was a lot of people killed on the streets of Sudan. So Seifeddine, it seems pretty much inevitable, unless there's a compromise, and it doesn't look like there's going to be one at the moment. It looks like there is going to be some kind of confrontation.
The issue is when we talk about confrontation, in any political system there is some type of confrontation. But what's different about where we live is that all political confrontation is violent. It leads to death, it leads to torture, and it leads to huge consequences and penalties for anybody that wants to see a different system or different politics being played out. So confrontation is going to happen. It's part of the political process. But is this confrontation and the resultant deaths and destruction necessary?
Inevitable, but perhaps
no. I think that
not.
The big problem that we're seeing right now is that we're trying to simplify an issue where it's more complicated. The Emiratis.
We have to do that in a half-hour program. You're talking about the world in general, or
no? I'm just saying.
Today?
I'm talking about what's happening in the Middle East. The Emiratis, the Saudis, all of these countries, they simply want to have the status quo in a world that's changing. Every single Arab society, even African societies, are changing. They want to have less authoritarianism. They want to have more say about what's going on. There's a simply lack of realism in these incumbent states.
Which leads us to the general question here, and each one of you can throw in whatever you think is worth it at this point, is are we seeing the second version, if you like, of the Arab Spring?
It's the end of the Arab Spring in a lot of ways, because the uprisings, the way that the uprisings happen in Tunisia, for instance, you're not going to get the same reaction second time round, because all of the Arab states have learned from all the other iterations, and they're learning from each other, sharing intelligence, and they're combating in different ways what's happening. So I wasn't surprised what was happening in Sudan, because in Sudan the factions are many. They have different views and visions about what they want on the ground. So part of the process, part of the real kind of what's interesting is that are we going to see a more mature, active populace that will want a specific vision for Sudan? Right? And that's what's going to really hurt and really change things on the ground in Sudan. If that's not happening, I'm not very sure that things will change that quickly.
Do you agree with that, Ian? First of all, then come to you, Neglaa, that it isn't the start of another Arab Spring or signs of new growth. It is perhaps the signal of the end.
I mean, I do agree that it's hard to be optimistic about the way things are likely to develop, given that we're now, 8 years since the Arab Spring began in Tunisia. And the countries that support the maintenance of the status quo have indeed learned how to deal with it. And they haven't learned recently either. I mean, back in 2011, 2012, the then King of Saudi Arabia basically threw money at the problem, spent, I think I'm right in saying, about $130 billion on ensuring that the germ, if you like, of the Arab Spring didn't extend to
and
Saudi
then
Arabia.
2013, that led to the overthrow of Morsi, who'd been elected, and he died very recently, but that was the end of it in Egypt.
It led to
Saudi's investment had worked.
It led to the overthrow of Morsi, but meanwhile, it's important to look at what happened in Syria too. In March 2011, I was lucky enough to be able to see that, the beginnings of the Syrian uprising. It was no more and no less than the aspiration to overthrow a dictatorship. Despite
But it began with
that's been
student
said
protests,
since.
right?
Began with protests in the southern city of Deraa, and very quickly indeed, the Syrian regime cracked down on it, and then people started intervening. And as a result, the Syrian uprising has cost the destruction of a country, 500,000 dead, 2/3 of the population displaced. And that's also part of the story too. Now, people had mixed motives, different motives for intervening, but they all intervened in support of what they thought served their interests. And that's also part of it.
So I suppose what I'm actually wondering is this a real threat to the GCC rulers, or is it just a perceived threat which they now know how to deal with?
I think there's that. Regimes are learning how to deal with popular uprising, but I think protests are also learning as well. So it goes both ways.
Sorry, who are?
Protesters.
Oh, protesters, yeah,
within
yeah.
the Middle East are also learning. And I think it's slightly premature to suggest that Arab Spring is dead. I mean, historians will decide in 20, 30 years' time whether the Arab Spring did have a major impact in the regime's thinking and their policies. I mean, historically, revolutions are always messy, and they don't end in 5 years, 10 years. It takes generations. There's waves after waves, sometimes 30 years, 40 years. So I think the verdict's still out on that. But I think the most important thing is that lessons have been learned. Regimes are learning lessons. Protesters are also learning lessons. And the major lesson they're learning, I think, is that you cannot simply topple a regime without any foresight. We learned that from a state point of view, from the US invasion of Iraq, simply taking away a brutal dictator really is opening up yourself to Pandora's box and opening up to messy violence. And also from a bottom up, when revolutions topple regimes, you also see messy outcomes. So there needs to be thinking from activists on the ground. What is the conclusion of all this?
Well, let's bring it back to Neglaa here. If you believe the protesters have learned, and therefore will be able to get something out of this, what have they learned? And equally, have the authorities, the military, in this case the TMC, Transitional Military Council, also got a few new tricks that they might not have had 7, 8 years ago?
I think it's definitely, I do agree with you. It's very early to say if this is the end of the Arab Spring. I think it definitely is a tug of war. I think both parties have learnt a lot, the Transitional Military Council and the protesters. I think with the Sudanese Professionals Association and the Forces of Freedom Change in general, I think the movement, they are very wise to what's happening. They're very educated, and I think they have learnt from a lot of the revolutions and uprisings that have happened.
Did they take a
across the world.
particular look at what happened in Tunisia?
In Tunisia and Egypt especially.
Yeah, but Tunisia where it worked,
yeah.
Egypt where it didn't.
Exactly.
What lessons were learned?
Especially with Egypt, considering if we compare the Rabaa massacre to what happened in the sit-in, it's almost identical and quite convenient considering that Burhan and Mohammed Hamdan, aka Hameti, had just visited Sisi. So I think there is very much of they've been looking and analysing what's happened there. This has gone right, okay, like the civil disobedience, it was done in Egypt and it was fairly, successful, fairly impactful. Okay, so what went wrong exactly with the civil disobedience? The fact that it's not a sustainable movement, considering that many live under poverty. How did they get the money? How did they survive?
So the Egyptian authorities just had, or military, just had to wait it out effectively.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so how can that be different in Sudan?
In terms of whether, as well, when you're mentioning new tricks, I don't believe the military council has showed us any new tricks as of yet.
Yeah.
If they have some coming, that time will tell. But I think what's happening is very repetitive. And I think that's why the SPA and just even the older generation in Sudan in general are very wise to the justifications they come out with, the plans and the attacks that they will do. They're very wise to it, and it's very repetitive.
What was learned from looking at what happened in Tunisia, which is where the Arab Spring started, largely successful, largely non-violent. You'd now call it a revolution, wouldn't you, rather than just an uprising? Your father was part of it.
I think I would call it deep reform, because in Tunisia there was no sense of, there was a negotiated settlement. There was a gridlock within the system, and the individuals who were protesting and the different powers that be that were represented on the ground went in, and the first port of call was the people that arrested them or the people that were oppressing them first. They negotiated with them first and started this continued mediation effort over time until the constitution was.
But there wasn't the same pressure from outside that there might be in Sudan.
There wasn't in Tunisia, surely there wasn't the outside intervention that is such an important factor, was that? I mean, the French interior minister said something about, about sending the police, but that didn't last for very long, did it?
Because at that time, Clinton was very pro, Tunisian revolution.
But there weren't the outside influences, which there are in Sudan. So when you look at what happened with
there was a positive outside influence.
Yeah, exactly. There was a positive American outside
influence. Can you learn
influence.
anything from this?
I think the main thing jumped at me straight away was the peacefulness. But I think in terms of negotiation, it's been tried in Sudan, but like you've mentioned, the outside forces and the support that the military council has gives them almost a sense of confidence that is very difficult to negotiate. That no matter what proposals are put forward, what we're seeing from the TMC is them sort of delaying. Okay, no, we're not really happy with this point. We're not really happy with that point. And I think that all comes down to the backing that they're getting that makes them feel confident that they can walk away from the table.
One of the other things that's been said, Nasim, let me come to you. One of the other things that's been said is that the fear of the GCC authorities, the rulers, is that what they're seeing is an Islamist uprising, which it was perhaps in Egypt with Morsi, head of the Muslim Brotherhood there. But I don't detect, if you've got the Sudanese professionals or association involved in this, that it is necessarily an Islamist uprising. Ennahda may well have been initially in Tunisia, but it changed its tune slightly and became a populist movement. Your father had to make compromises. Is that a fear?
I think the term, the way it's been used now, Islamist is anyone which the Arab regimes dislike. So this idea that somehow every uprising is an Islamist uprising is just bogeyman when it comes to politics in the Middle East. So, and in Sudan, I think it's also less true, because if you think about it, when Omar Bashir came to power, was on the back of an Islamist uprising. He was part of, although he turned his back, you can say, but the deep state within Sudan, many would say, was an Islamist deep state. So when does it not become an Islamist state? When is it an Islamist state? So when the Gulf countries use those rhetoric, this kind of rhetoric, I think it's just a way to justify their interference, justify their support of the military regime, and get support from the West.
So you would say that each one of these has been a popular uprising that perhaps has been labelled an Islamist uprising because it suits those people against it to do so?
Well, no doubt, but bear in mind, most of these countries are 95% Muslim majority countries, so most of them will be Muslims. So many of them will be conservative Muslims, many of them will be liberal modernist Muslims. So there'll be Muslims of all flavors. So it's easy to say, this is just a bunch of Islamists who are trying to undermine the state and somehow buying the support of the West for their clampdown. So Islam has just become a taboo, a word just to use to suppress popular uprising within the Middle East, and it's really used for people, the Gulf countries and the military authoritarian rulers.
In the way perhaps that the Americans referred, or the authorities refer to socialism as a sort of
that's right.
the work of the devil. Can you tell us when it comes to this particular country, rather than the broader picture now? I hear Seifeddine Island mentioned quite a lot. Now this is a northwest of the country, if you like. It's a port city, and it's bang opposite Saudi Arabia at that point. Why is this perhaps an important thing to watch?
Look, there's no doubt that the economic interests of outside actors and even the military itself is a huge sticking point for what's going on in Sudan. That the settlement, the peaceful settlement of these popular demands are going to be hampered by the economic stakes and the security stakes for all outside actors as well. So Seifeddine Island, the island that was leased to the Turkish government, is a sticking point. But the bigger problem, the real problem as I see it, is not just this. There's a bigger one. There's a bigger thing going on. We want change in this region. But the way that things happened, where people rise up and suddenly we expect the whole regime to fall, I think that's over. I think we're looking at a much longer process now. So the Arab Spring, in the sense of people waking up, rising, and then the regime topples, that's not going to happen anymore. Okay.
I think there's no doubt that the countries on either side of the divide are also pursuing their own strategic interests. There's no question about that. Whether they're inclined towards supporting Islamist movements, even if that is an exaggeration, there is an Islamist component in certainly in many of these places, certainly in Libya. So, Turkey and Qatar are supporting these popular uprisings, but they're also pursuing their own interests as well. They're not entirely philanthropic in what they do, just as the Saudis and the Emiratis, when they gave $3 billion to the Sudanese government after the fall of Bashir, are also not being philanthropic.
And we mustn't forget that the Sudanese have provided soldiers fighting on behalf of Saudi in the Yemen conflict as well.
30,000 men from the, many of them children actually, from the Janjaweed militia, who we all know was accused of war crimes in Darfur.
What makes a revolution succeed? It did in Tunisia. Give us your thoughts quickly on that. And then we'll talk about maybe somewhere else where it might succeed.
Realistic idealism.
What's unrealistic then?
In the sense of, just because you want change and just because there is a moment where everybody wants that change, doesn't mean that you will get what you want. Things bounce back, people react, regimes shift and change. I think that if you're talking about a revolution within the region, it is still happening. With everything, the way that all these states and governments are reacting, they are accelerating the process, not decelerating it.
Neglaa, your family are still out there.
Yes.
Try and help me understand what you think will make this work.
I think exactly what you mean about realistic ideas. It's once, say, for example, we reached a step where you've taken out Burhan, Mohammed Hamdan, all the key players, all the underdogs. We're still talking about over 30 years of destruction. If the SBA now come and take power, it's not just, okay, we've got a civilian government, let's sit back, it's brilliant, everything's happy and nice moving forward, because there's a lot of issues that need to be fixed. I mean, what about all the people that haven't had access to their salaries since it's been almost a year now? What do we do about our medical system? We don't have ambulances. Like, does the medical system now become free? How do we make it accessible to people? What happens to education? What about the destruction of University of Khartoum that the Janjaweed have done? People have not been in university for almost a year. So there's a lot of Like it's
And,
like you
and
said,
are the
it's that
people who are
simple.
part of the Sudan Professionals Association, which is much broader than just
Yeah, it
professionals,
is, yeah.
are they smart enough to understand what needs to be done to make this work?
Honestly,
You have to
at this
dismantle an
point,
entire state
yeah,
apparatus.
at this point, I'm very optimistic. I think they have proven that they're very capable and they're very aware, and they will be able to actually dismantle the regime at whole. Honestly, until this day, I don't have any doubt in that. But I think as well, time will only tell. Like, we need to be realistic that, you know, we've had optimism before. Like, I was in Egypt. Unfortunately, again, at the time of the uprising, I found myself there, and I was very optimistic, and that just went and took a turn for the worst. So we need to be realistic and open to the fact that it may just at any point completely switch.
Perhaps the triumph of hope over expectation.
Yeah,
but at least
exactly.
you're still hoping. Thank you all very much indeed. It always goes far too fast. There's so much more that we could and should perhaps be discussing. But we've been talking about what's going on in Sudan and the broader implications of that to the entire Middle East region and to revolutions, popular uprisings, if you want, what it means to them, why they work, why they don't work. From me, David Foster, from my guests here at the Roundtable, we'll see you next time, I hope. Goodbye for now.